Imagine a time when the Mediterranean's waves held the key to the future of all Western culture. One day, the world's largest empire deployed its unstoppable fleet to finally destroy Christian resistance. A time when naval warfare would be irrevocably altered by a revolutionary weapon. This is the story of the hidden weapon that determined the fate of millions of people at the Battle of Lepanto, which took place on October 7th, 1571. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel if you like to read intriguing tales about historical turning points, military strategy, and scientific advancement. We must go back several decades to understand the background of a world on the verge of collapse in order to completely comprehend what transpired on that tragic day in the Gulf of Patras. Empires engaged in conflicts that reshaped borders, cultures, and the very path of human history during the 16th century, a period of remarkable change. Under Sultan Selim II, the Ottoman Empire had grown to be the most dreaded entity on the planet. In 1453, his soldiers overthrew Constantinople, bringing an end to a millennium of Byzantine history and paving the way for unheard-of growth. The Ottomans had no boundaries after that. They dominated North Africa, marched into Eastern Europe, overran Hungary, besieged Vienna, and turned the Mediterranean into what many now refer to as a Turkish lake. Maritime power was personified by the Ottoman Navy. Their galleys, long, thin boats driven mostly by oars, moved swiftly through the water. Hundreds of oarmen, many of whom were Christian slaves who had been seized in earlier conflicts and were destined to live cruel lives in the lower echelons of the ships. Above them, elite troops called janissaries readied themselves for the inevitable hand-to-hand fighting that ensued after every naval engagement. The Ottoman approach was simple, but incredibly effective. With the help of hundreds of coordinated oars, their galleys raced toward the direction of the enemy. When the two ships collided, grappling hooks held them together while a bronze spur in the bow of the ship punctured the enemy's hull. Then the real nightmare started. In unrelenting waves, janissaries with scimitars, bows, and arquebuses flooded the opponent decks. Few forces in the world could resist the Ottomans, whose generations-long refinement of this style of warfare. However, Ottoman power extended beyond its military might. They had a highly effective administrative apparatus that could mobilize resources from 3 continents. In a few days, their arsenals in Istanbul could assemble a whole galley. Through their trading routes, which linked Asia and Europe, they brought unthinkable wealth that supported ever more ambitious expansions. Despite not having his father, Suleiman the Magnificent's, military prowess, Sultan Selim II inherited a well-oiled war machine and was keen to conquer more territory. At the same time, Christian Europe was in dire straits. Deep divisions existed among the nations that ought to have united to confront a common peril. Christendom had been split apart by the Protestant Reformation, leading to rivalries that sometimes appeared more fierce than the actual war with Islam. Despite being Catholic, France kept practical ties with the Ottomans in order to undermine its Habsburg adversaries. Events in the far-off Mediterranean were of less importance to England than its own domestic problems and the increasing Spanish menace. Only a handful of powers were vigilant about the Ottoman advance. Having inherited a kingdom where the sun never set, Philip II's Spain recognized the importance of maintaining sovereignty over the Mediterranean. One by one, the trade avenues of the Republic of Venice, the Adriatic's commercial gem, were being choked off. The Papal States of Pius V understood that if the Ottomans were not kept in check, Rome itself might be in danger. The Ottoman occupation of Cyprus served as the impetus for the decisive conflict. After a cruel siege that lasted for over a year, the island, which had been a Venetian fortress for over a century, fell.
Although valiant, the Phoenician resistance was in vain. The Venetian commander, Mar Antonio Bragadin, was guaranteed safe conduct upon the eventual surrender of the capital Famagusta in August of 1571. Rather, he endured unspeakable torture before being flayed alive, his skin filled with straw, and then on display in Istanbul as a trophy. All of Europe was appalled by this act of cruelty, which ultimately served as the catalyst for a Christian alliance. Pope Pius V, a man of unwavering resolve and astute political acumen, put up endless effort to create an alliance that seemed unattainable. He needed to bring together Spain, which saw the Venetians as annoying rivals in trade, and Venice, which had lost Cyprus and demanded retribution. He had to include the Knights of St. Stephen, the Orders of Malta, Savoy, Genoa, and the Papal States. Every one of these powers has its own interests, goals, and mistrust of the others. The Pope accomplished what many thought was impossible by combining deft diplomacy, passionate religious pleas, and promises of tangible advantages. The Holy League was established in May of 1571, a group of Christian nations determined to stop the Ottoman invasion. According to the alliance's conditions, each member would provide resources, ships, and men. The majority of the fleet and the funding would come from Spain. The Pope would act as a mediator and a spiritual unifier, while Venice would provide its unmatched naval expertise. A young man was selected to lead this Christian armada, but he was already shrouded in myth. Even though Don John of Austria was just 24 years old, his name was already widely respected in Europe. Don Juan, the half-brother of King Philip II of Spain and the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V, had been raised distant from the courts and protected from political intrigue until his brother eventually acknowledged him and elevated him to a position of authority. By putting down the Moorish uprising in Granada, Don Juan had demonstrated his military value by exhibiting not just courage on a personal level, but also tactical proficiency and the capacity to instill strong loyalty to his soldiers. He was ambitious, cultured, charming, and attractive. Some said he had dreams about retaking Constantinople and establishing his own authority over the former Byzantine Empire. He wanted to be king of some recently captured kingdom, others murmured. His courage and unwavering resolve, however, were unquestioned. In summer 1571, the Holy League fleet started to gather in Messina, Sicily. It was a remarkable logistical achievement. From all over the western Mediterranean, ships came. In addition to soldiers and sailors, each brought supplies, weapons, ammunition, and intricate chains of command that represented the political conflicts within the alliance. The colors of the Republic of St. Mark's were painted on sleek, fast Venetian galleys. There were larger, better-armed Spanish galleons. Malta, the Papal States, Genoa, and dozens of other lesser principalities sent ships. One of these ships was unique. Few had seen it before, and the majority of seasoned commanders were very skeptical about it. These were the galleass ships, which marked a significant advancement in naval architecture. Galleases were real sea monsters, in contrast to traditional galleys, which were low, narrow, and mostly dependent on speed and maneuverability. They had towering 4.5 deck houses, were higher and larger, and carried more cannon than a typical galley could have. This concept was the result of decades of experimenting by the Venetians, who have historically been the most adventurous naval innovators in the Mediterranean. A normal galleasse was more than 40 meters long and could move several hundred tons. Its hull was strengthened to support the weight and recoil of dozens of cannon. It had large gun pieces positioned at the bow that could fire projectiles weighing at least 20 kilograms across long distances. And a devastating field of fire was produced by rows of smaller cannons. But the real revolution was not just about the quantity of firearms, but about the battle mentality they embodied.
Naval combat in the Mediterranean had been largely an infantry conflict fought on floating platforms for ages. The plan was to approach, board, and fight close quarters. There was artillery, but it was viewed more as a boarding maneuver assistance than as the game-changing weapon. Giasis suggested a completely different approach, eliminating the adversary from afar before they could even approach close enough to board. There was a lot of opposition to this concept. Giasis were considered clumsy aberrations by veteran commanders who had spent decades honing the art of galley warfare. In a combat when speed and agility would determine victory, they were slow, hard to maneuver, and reliant on the wind for efficient movement. These floating fortresses, according to skeptics, would be more of a liability than a benefit. They would be sitting ducks, too enormous to lose and too slow to get away, according to some. But Austria's Don John noticed something unusual. He understood that Giasis might establish anchor points in a battle line, making it hard for any galley trying to advance to kill the enemy, even while they couldn't chase them. In his combat formation, he chose to include 6 Venetian galleasses, a choice that would turn out to be vitally important. On the other side of the Mediterranean, another powerful force was mobilizing while the Christian fleet was getting ready in Messina. The Sultan had given direct orders to Mezzin Saad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman fleet's chief admiral, cleared the path for an invasion of southern Italy by definitively destroying the Christian fleet. One of the few admirals who had survived the Ottoman court's periodic purges was Ali Pasha, a seasoned and well-respected commander. He oversaw a fleet of about 300 galleys, all of which were manned by slaves and seasoned combatants who had been trained to the harsh cadence of the oars. Ottoman assurance verged on conceit. Over the preceding decades, they had frequently defeated Christian fleets. Their most recent triumph had been decisive and total in Cyprus. They thought the Holy League fleet would just be another addition to their extensive list of victories, and apparently with good reason. Several Ottoman leaders were already publicly debating their post-victory plans, including which Italian cities to capture first and how much land could be added to the empire. The Holy League fleet finally sailed from Messina in September of 1571. Any observer would have been mesmerized by the sight. The turquoise waters of the Mediterranean were covered in a rainbow carpet of sails as more than 200 galleys and galleons cruised in formation. From each mast, religious banners hung. The light shone on golden crosses, and the sound of commands and drums reverberated over the waters. More than 80,000 men traveled on these ships. Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, was one of these troops. He was a young, ordinary soldier in a Spanish company at the time. On the day of the war, he had a fever, yet he insisted on fighting despite his weakening health and refused to stay below deck. He would pay a heavy price for his bravery. He would live to write about that wonderful day, despite suffering 3 arquebus wounds, one of which would permanently disable his left hand. Seeking the Ottoman fleet, the Christian fleet headed east across the Adriatic. With every day that went by, anxiety increased. Inconsistent rumors kept coming in. Some asserted that the Ottomans had spent the winter in Istanbul. Others asserted they were close by, awaiting an ambush in some secret bay. Despite his unwavering discipline, Don John started to question whether a battle would really take place that year. Then, as the Christian fleet approached Greece's western shore early on October 7th, observers atop the mast yelled the warning that everyone had feared and anticipated. "Sails! Lots! Many sails!" The Christian fleet had been located, or perhaps the Ottoman navy had been located. The battle that would determine the destiny of the Mediterranean was about to start. Near the city of Lepanto, close to the mouth of the Gulf of Patras, the 2 fleets clashed at dawn.
It was a suitably dramatic scenario. To the north, the Greek mountains towered magnificently, their slopes still covered in morning mist. There was only a light wind coming from the west, and the sea was comparatively quiet. In a galley combat, where speed and mobility are crucial, these would be perfect conditions. Don Juan called a last war meeting with his top commanders right away. In addition to the looming conflict, there was still mistrust between the Spanish and Venetian leaders, which added to the tension. The Venetians sought fast and complete retribution after losing Cyprus and thousands of their citizens. The more circumspect Spanish recalled that maintaining the fleet was just as crucial as winning the conflict. Don Juan had to prepare a strategy for battle while juggling these competing priorities. The formation for the battle was well prepared. 3 major divisions, each around 3 miles wide, would make up the Christian fleet. On board the Galley Royal, a splendid ship decked out in crimson and gold silk, Don Juan would personally lead the center division. Giovanni Andrea Doria, the commander of the Genoese galleys and one of the fleet's most seasoned admirals, would be on his right, leading the southern wing. Agostino Barbaro, a Venetian admiral who was determined to exact revenge for the loss of Cyprus, would command the northern wing on his left. There were the galleasses after that. Don Juan made the vital decision to place 2 of these 6 ships across from each division at the front of the Christian fighting line. They were supposed to absorb and thwart the early Ottoman attack, acting as a first line of defense. It was a dangerous tactic. The galleasses would only become barriers for the Christian fleet itself if they were unable to halt the enemy's progress. However, they may stop the Ottoman charge before it started, if they carried out their strategy. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha divided his fleet into 3 divisions. He had a significant numerical advantage, with over 300 galleys, compared to about 28 Christian warships. His plan was tried and true: move quickly, encircle the Christian fleet's wings with superior numbers, and then converge on the center in a devastating pincer movement. It was the same strategy that had previously destroyed innumerable Christian fleets. Mehmet Syakko, a seasoned leader who was an expert in Greek waters, commanded the Ottoman right wing. Ulujali, an Italian outlaw who had converted to Islam and turned into one of the most feared corsairs in the Mediterranean, commanded the left wing. Ulujali was renowned for both his cruelty and his guile. He had started out as a fisherman, been taken prisoner by Barbary pirates, converted, and worked his way up to become one of the Ottoman fleet's most prosperous admirals. Both fleets were prepared by midday. The historical significance of the event went beyond the actual combat. Religions, cultures, and essentially disparate worldviews collided. Both sides felt they were battling for their way of life's survival, not just for political dominance or territory. In a move that would go down in folklore, Don Juan had a huge crucifix placed on his galley's mast. Then, on a small boat, he visited every division in the fleet, talking to commanders and regular soldiers, encouraging them and reminding them of the stakes. He reportedly informed the men that their fight was for their families' freedom, their homes' protection, and their faith's preservation. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha issued his own exhortations. He reminded his men of the innumerable triumphs they had achieved, the Christians' frailty and disarray, and the certainty of their victory. He offered wealth, slaves, and eternal glory for those who fought well. The sound of the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite men, beating their weapons on their shields in a loud pattern, seemed to vibrate the waves. Then the order was given at about 12:30. The Ottoman galleys began to move forward, their oars hitting the water in perfect time. It was a beautiful and a terrible sight. Hundreds of ships, their green banners flapping in the wind, their sharp prows slicing through the waves, all moving like one organism.
It was a deafening sound. The sound of drumming, rowers' cries, and the creaking of wood under tremendous pressure. The Christian fleet waited, still in formation. The period of uncertainty preceding engagement was the most challenging aspect of any conflict. Many men prayed, some silently, some out loud, when they were alone with their thoughts and anxieties. Final absolution was given by priests who traveled among the men. For the 100th time, commanders inspected their guns. The galleasses then started shooting when the Ottoman galleys in the vanguard got to a distance of roughly 1,000 meters. The Ottomans were totally unprepared for the devastating impact. A wall of smoke and flames was produced by the nearly simultaneous firing of the big cannons on the galleas's citadel. The Ottoman galleys spearheading the assault were hit by 20-kilogram iron rounds that sailed through the air at alarming speeds. Carnage ensued. In addition to piercing the hull, the projectile that struck a galley full of men continued its journey through entire columns of troops and oarsmen, transforming flesh and bone into a red mist. Wood splinters turned into secondary projectiles that were just as lethal as the bullet. They tore off oars, slamming their operators against the banks or tossing them overboard. Several Ottoman galleys in the vanguard were reduced to floating wreckage in a matter of minutes. Just as devastating as the physical effects were the psychological ones. The Ottomans anticipated a typical battle. They intended to get on board as soon as possible and prevail via superior hand-to-hand fighting. This type of concentrated artillery fire was unanticipated by anyone. The ranks behind the galleys were confused as the front of the formation tried to escape. Even before the actual fighting started, the Ottoman configuration that was supposed to be a strong lance penetrating the Christian center started to disintegrate. The Ottomans, however, were skilled combatants. They would not easily surrender. In an attempt to pass the galleasses before they could reload and fire again, they regrouped and resumed their attack, their galleys accelerating as quickly as they could. Numerous people succeeded in this hard race. Despite having a lot of firepower, the galleasses had a small field of fire and were slow to reload. They were smashed into the main Christian line by dozens of Ottoman galleys. It was a titanic battle. With a crash that reverberated for miles, wood struck wood. Thousands of men plunged into deadly conflict. Grappling hooks held ships together, and spurs punctured hulls. Ali Pasha's galley and Don Juan's galley crashed head-on in the middle of the line. This duel between the two supreme commanders seemed to have been orchestrated by fate. One of the bloodiest conflicts in history ensued on the royal galley. The Spanish thirds faced the Ottoman janissaries, the best soldiers in their empire. Arquebuses were close-range shooters. Swords and scimitars fought. Men fought and died in such close quarters that the pressure from the bodies around them kept the dead standing. Don Juan led his warriors by example, as he fought himself, his blade smeared with blood. The conflict swung back and forth for 3 hours. With their usual zeal, the Ottomans were able to temporarily seize the royal galley's forecastle. There were terrible moments when it seemed like Don Juan would be killed or captured. But the Christians reclaimed the lost territory when reinforcements from nearby galleys arrived. The crowded deck was hit by the fire of arquebusiers in the battle turrets. Each shot killed a man, as in wheat grains under a sickle. Equally intense combat raged on the wings. Mehmed Siaco was opposed by Agostino Barbero's Venetians. Remembering Cyprus and the fate of Marc Antonio Bagadin, the Venetians fought with a special ferocity. Although an arrow injured Barbero's eye early in the combat, he refused to leave the deck, continuing to give orders while heavily bleeding. The Ottoman galleys were taken aback by the strength of the opposition and eventually began to lose ground to the Venetian wing.
However, things were different in the southern wing. The Italian outlaw Ulu Jalli proved why he was regarded as one of the Mediterranean's most shrewd leaders. When he saw the frontal attack was not working, he made a bold flanking move. His galleys threatened to engulf the entire formation as they circled the southern end of the Christian line. The southern Christian wing's commander, Giovanni Andrea Dora, had to widen his line to prevent flanking, which resulted in hazardous openings in the formation. Ulu Jalli mercilessly took advantage of these openings. His galleys caused confusion and mayhem when they broke through the Christian line. He killed the commander of the Order of Malta's flagship galley, took it as a trophy, and destroyed the order's standard.
For a brief moment, the entire fleet appeared to be at risk of the Christian southern flank collapsing. However, the real genius of Don Juan's construction came to light at this crucial juncture. Some of the most potent Spanish and Venetian galleys were among the reserve of galleys he had kept behind the main line. He deployed this reserve to get the situation under control when it became clear that the southern wing was in danger. These galleys, led by Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, launched a deadly counterattack that drove Ulujali's galleys back and restored the Christian line. The conflict on the royal galley came to a head in the middle. On the bow of his galley, Ottoman Supreme Commander Ali Pasha was engaged in direct combat when he was hit by an arquebus shot. He was mortally wounded. He was hurried by Christian soldiers right away, and his head was cut off and elevated on a spear in a matter of seconds. The Ottoman fleet beheld its deceased commander and let out a scream of horror. The Christians, on the other hand, roared with victory that made the river seem to quake. The pivotal moment came with the death of Ali Pasha. The Holy League standard took the place of the Sultan's, which had flown with pride from his galley's mast. The psychological impact of this symbolic act was catastrophic. Ottoman galleys that had just been engaged in ferocious combat started to falter. Commanders who had boldly launched attacks started to think about pulling back. The battle soon took a critical turn. Earlier in the engagement, galleys fire had already broken up the Ottoman formation, and now it was falling apart. Many galleys were so entangled with Christian vessels that they were unable to escape despite their best efforts. Others were able to escape, but they discovered they had nowhere to go. The Christian fleet blocked the only way out to the open sea, and the bay was encircled by land on 3 sides. The conflict that followed was more like an execution. One by one, Ottoman galleys were pursued and destroyed. Desperate to allow their crews to escape via land, some ran ground on the coast. Others were cornered and had to surrender after a brief but intense battle. The surface was littered with deaths, wreckage, and desperate individuals trying to swim to safety, and the sea was scarlet with blood. The fight of Lepanto was virtually over by late afternoon. More than 200 of the almost 300 galleys Ali Pasha had commanded that morning had either been prisoner or destroyed. An additional 8,000 Ottomans had been taken prisoner, and about 30,000 had died. The most notable of these was the release of 15,000 Christians who had been slaves on the Ottoman galleys. For years or even decades, many of them were bound to the oars. Even while they were significant, Christian losses were substantially lower. 8,000 people were killed, and perhaps twice as many were injured. They had lost 13 galleys. By any standard, the victory was devastating. In one afternoon of combat, the Ottoman fleet's invincibility, a belief that had been ingrained for generations, had been utterly destroyed. As the sun set over the Gulf of Patras, casting a red and golden glow over the floating wreckage, Don Juan explored the battlefield. He thanked the survivors, visited the wounded, and consoled the dying. It was starting to become clear how much had been accomplished. This was no ordinary naval triumph.
It was a pivotal moment in history. Everyone could now see the secret weapon that had been so important to this win. Even though the galleasses were undeniably important, it wasn't simply them. It was the revolutionary idea that they stood for. Naval artillery's ability to be a decisive weapon rather than just a tool to aid in boarding maneuvers. The battle's dynamics had been drastically altered from the first few minutes by the 6 Venetian galleasses. Before the Ottoman galleys could even engage in close action, their concentrated fire had damaged or destroyed many of them. More significantly, they had halted the Ottoman attack's psychological momentum. Before they had reached their targets, the Turkish commanders, who were used to running into enemy lines, found themselves soaring through a field of destruction. The hesitancy and confusion brought up by this first disturbance gave the Christian fleet the early advantage. However, the tale of Lepanto's secret weapon extends much beyond the galleasses. It also dealt with the more general changes in naval combat that were occurring at the time. Ships were used as platforms for men to be transported before engaging in close battle, making maritime warfare in the Mediterranean virtually an extension of land warfare for centuries. The realization that the ship itself, equipped with potent weaponry, could be the deciding weapon was the real breakthrough at Lepanto. It took time for this change to occur. For decades, the Venetians had experimented with various naval artillery layouts, cannon calibers, and firing platform arrangements. Generations of strategic thinking and technical improvement produced the galleasses battled at Lepanto. They represented a significant investment in modern naval doctrine, in addition to material resources. The crew of a galleass differed greatly from those of a galley. A galleass inverted this ratio, whereby a galley needed hundreds of oarsmen but just a small number of gunners. It needed skilled gunners who could control intricate cannons in the tumultuous environment of battle. Officers with knowledge of ballistics, range, ammo type, and reload time were needed. A new type of sailor was needed for a new type of naval combat. Despite their superior military capabilities, the Ottomans had been slower to embrace these developments. Galley techniques were ingrained in their nautical culture and had proven to be effective for many years. Why alter a formula that works? At Lepanto, their unwillingness to innovate and dependence on tried-and-true techniques ultimately cost them dearly. The full extent of the triumph became clear in the weeks after the fight as the Holy League fleet recovered and reorganized. Across Europe, messengers hurried with news that looked too good to be true. The Ottoman navy, which was unbeatable, had been destroyed. They had stopped the Islamic expansion in the Mediterranean. The biggest naval triumph in centuries has been achieved by Christendom. It was a wild celebration. Every Christian city had its church bells ringing. The streets were crowded with Thanksgiving processions. When Pope Pius Quintus heard the news, he knelt in prayer after having worked so hard to create the Holy League. He declared October 7th to be Our Lady of the Rosary's Day in remembrance in Venice and credited the victory to divine intervention. The celebration lasted for days, wine flowing freely in the squares and fireworks lighting up the night sky. Austria's Don John became the most acclaimed hero in Europe right away. He had led the century's biggest naval triumph at the age of 24. Poets wrote poems in his honor. His portrait was painted by artists. Women all around Christendom moaned in admiration of this attractive and successful young fighter. Even greater things looked to be in store for him, possibly even the conquest of Constantinople that so many had hoped for. However, history took a different turn than anticipated, as often is the case. Almost immediately after the conflict, the Holy League, which had been built with so much effort earlier, started to fall apart. The ancient conflicts between Spain and Venice reappeared.
Every power had its own goals and priorities. Venice quickly negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans because it was tired from the war and wanted to reclaim its trade routes. Spain shifted its energies elsewhere as it became more worried about uprisings in the Netherlands and relations with England. Don Juan was never able to take use of his triumph. He was assigned to lead the Spanish Netherlands, where he engaged in a tiresome and never-ending conflict with Dutch insurgents. Far from the splendor of Lepanto, in a damp and freezing military tent, he succumbed to typhoid disease in 1578 at the age of 33. His body was dismembered and kept in salt to stop it from decomposing, while being transported covertly back to Spain. It was a tragic conclusion for the Ottomans, and such a brilliant hero. They showed incredible fortitude. "You Christians have burned our beard, but it will grow back stronger," the Grand Vizier famously remarked. "You chopped off our arm, and it will never grow back." There was truth to what he was saying about the fall of Cyprus, which was still under Ottoman control. Istanbul's arsenals constructed a new fleet of more than 200 galleys in less than a year. Even though they had plenty of resources to hire and train new sailors after losing many seasoned ones at Lepanto, something essential had changed. It had destroyed the Ottoman illusion of invincibility. Their defeat, their strategies, and the fact that their empire was not the manifest destiny that many had started to assume had all been demonstrated. Perhaps even more significant than the actual military triumph was this change in mindset. The faith of the Christian powers was restored. In coastal cities, the panic that had raged for generations started to fade. Most importantly, Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean came to an end with Lepanto. They never again made a serious attempt to invade Italy or pose a threat to the heartland of Western Christendom. Despite controlling Cyprus and remaining a formidable force for centuries, gradually they focused on other frontiers in the Caucasus, Persia, and the Balkans. Lepanto's secret weapon, the galleasses, met an intriguing end. Although it would take decades to fully actualize, they stood for the future of naval combat. They were a temporary fix, which was the problem. Even though they were more powerful than conventional galleys, they still used oars to maneuver to some extent. They were a precursor to the 18th century line of ships. The battleships and frigates were equipped with banks of cannons and ran solely on sail. But it would take generations to undergo this whole change. For another century, traditional galleys dominated the Mediterranean. In the short term, galleasses were less adaptable than regular galleys, needed specialist crews, and were costly to construct and maintain. So, even though they made a significant contribution at Lepanto, they did not immediately replace the fleets that were already in place. Rather, they functioned as a portent, a sign of the way forward. The creation of line-of-battle tactics in which highly armed sailing ships would cruise in parallel formations, exchanging artillery salvos until one side or the other was destroyed, would bring about the real revolution in naval warfare. More than 2 centuries later, at Trafalgar, Nelson would become an expert in this kind of naval warfare. But the roots of this revolution were sown at Lepanto, where naval artillery capability was definitively displayed for the first time. The story of Lepanto contains important truths that have stood the test of time. The first is about the power of technological advancement. Decades of triumphs had given the Ottomans a winning tradition, numerical supremacy, and a sense of confidence. But when they encountered a new technology for which they were unprepared and had not anticipated it, they lost their advantage. The galleasses changed the game's rules in ways that the Ottomans were unable to promptly adjust to. The second lesson is about the importance of unity in the face of existential threat. States that were typically rivals or even enemies came together to form the unexpected alliance known as the Holy League.
For many years, Spain and Venice had fought for power and trade. The goals of the Papal States were different. Venice was a rival of Genoa. However, these distinctions were momentarily forgotten in the face of the Ottoman menace. The key to triumph was this togetherness, which was so hard to attain and so brittle to preserve. Leadership is the subject of the third lesson. At the age of 24, Don John of Austria assumed command of the Holy League fleet. He commanded admirals who were considerably older and more seasoned than he was, yet he was youthful and rather inexperienced in naval combat. However, he was charismatic, brave, and had the capacity to motivate guys to perform at their highest level. Despite being controversial at the time, his choice to put Guy Lassus at the front of the formation turned out to be fantastic. Effective leadership has the power to increase any force's effectiveness. The persistence of unexpected consequences is the subject of the fourth lesson. Lepanto was heralded as a decisive triumph that would alter the path of history, and in a way it did, but not in the manner that its contemporaries had anticipated. Constantinople was not retaken. Ottoman power was not destroyed. Christendom was not brought together in a lasting crusade. Rather, its effects were longer lasting and more subtle. An increase in naval innovation, a change in the psychological balance of power, and a model for European collaboration against shared challenges. In the prologue to Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes, the young Spanish soldier who bravely fought at Lepanto in spite of his infirmity, would write proudly about the conflict. He referred to Lepanto as the greatest event in history. It was a life-changing event for him and the thousands of other soldiers who fought there. They had witnessed a watershed in history. They had taken part in something really great. Indeed, Lepanto has an epic quality that goes beyond the actual conflict. It marked the end of an era of naval warfare that dated back to ancient times and the final major GI engagement in the Mediterranean.
Lepanto was the culmination and conclusion of the strategies employed by the Romans against Carthage, the Byzantines against the Arabs, and Themistocles at Salamis. A new era of naval warfare using line ships and powerful weapons using entirely different tactics would follow. However, troops on both sides realized they had taken part in something unique when the sun sank over blood-stained waves and wreckage swept ashore on that October evening in 1571. They had watched as empires and civilizations clashed and as innovation triumphed over convention. Although the 6 Venetian galleasses played a significant role, they were not the only hidden weapon that decimated the Ottoman navy. It was the belief that the future belonged to those who could develop more quickly than their adversaries, that combat was evolving, and that technology and artillery were becoming more important than old tactics and sheer bravery. Over the ensuing centuries, this lesson would remain relevant. The Spanish found that the English had learned the lessons of Lepanto better than they had when they confronted the English Armada in 1588. The Spanish fleet was annihilated by the English ships who were more agile and had superior artillery, avoiding the close engagements the Spanish had anticipated. It was Lepanto in its purest form and on a larger scale. Nelson applied ideas from Lepanto when he routed the Spanish and French fleets at Trafalgar in 1805. Excellent artillery, innovative formations, and the guts to defy expectations. Torpedoes and submarines transformed naval combat in the 20th century, while steam-powered warships supplanted sailing ships in the 19th century. Each of these changes replicated the basic idea shown at Lepanto when aircraft carriers were pivotal in World War II. Traditional and numerical advantages can be overcome by technological innovation. The equilibrium between Europe and the Ottoman Empire that developed after Lepanto influenced generations of later history, and we now live in a world that was influenced by that far-off conflict more than 450 years ago. The age of discovery and the ensuing dominance of the European world were facilitated by the confidence that victory returned to Europe.
Despite their centuries-long dominance, the Ottomans were never able to pose a significant threat to Western Europe. Long ago, the galleys and galleasses that engaged in combat at Lepanto dissolved into dust. Centuries have passed since the men who sailed them. The empires they defended have either completely vanished or undergone unrecognizable change. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which had appeared so powerful in 1571, gradually fell apart and split up into dozens of contemporary country nations. The center of the Christian navy was supplied by Spain, which, long before, lost its empire. Now a museum city, Venice was the commercial republic that constructed the revolutionary galleasses. Only relics of its naval splendor can be found in palaces and artwork. However, Lepanto's core lesson is still applicable. Innovation can overcome traditional advantages. Even seemingly unbeatable foes can be vanquished. The balance of power can change more quickly than anyone expects due to technological advancements. Even fierce enemies can work together for their mutual gain during existential crises. It was not merely a machine or a strategy that annihilated the Ottoman navy at Lepanto. It was the readiness to question the status quo,
to think outside the box and to take a chance on innovation in opposition to tradition. It was the understanding that people would be left behind if they did not adapt to the changing world. It was the guts to spend money on new technologies even before their efficacy was established. It was the ability to look past the constraints of the here and now and toward the potential of the future. More than one battle was decided in the Gulf of Patras on that October day in 1571. It changed the course of naval combat. A lesson that would last for generations was imparted, and the equilibrium between Europe and Asia was altered. Even the most difficult challenges may be overcome with creativity, leadership, and cooperation. Looking back at that far-off day through the lens of history, we see not only a conflict, but also a turning point. We see the close of one era and the start of another. We see bravery and selflessness, brilliance and failure, success and sorrow. We see humanity at its most fierce, battling not only for dominance or territory, but also for basic ideas about what the ideal world ought to be. Those 6 Venetian galleasses, monstrous and revolutionary, are at the core of it all. The future always belonged to those who were willing to accept change, as evidenced by their rows of cannons spraying death and fire, shattering forms that had remained unaltered for ages. This is the tale of the Ottoman Navy's destruction in the Battle of Lepanto and the secret weapon that was used. It is a tale of innovation triumphing over tradition, bravery triumphing over statistics, and foresight triumphing over complacency. It serves as a reminder that no advantage lasts forever, no empire lasts forever, and that change is the only thing that has remained constant throughout history. And the moral of the narrative is that those who are prepared to jeopardize the present in pursuit of a new idea are the ones who will influence the future. Long since gone are the waves that smashed against the coasts of the Gulf of Patras that day, but their echoes reverberate through the ages, telling us that history can change in a day, that transformational moments are possible, and that what seemed unthinkable in the morning can become reality by sunset. For those who fought that day, however, their victory had a deeper meaning. By placing the crucifix atop his galley prior to combat, Don John of Austria recognized that his soldiers battled not only with tactics and weapons, but also with faith. All of them acknowledged a fundamental fact of their period and beliefs. When the Christian warriors prayed on the decks prior to the battle, when the priests administered final absolution, and when Pope Pius Quintus collapsed when he heard the news of the triumph. The triumph at Lepanto was attributed to divine providence in addition to military prowess or technological superiority. The Christian commanders felt that their weapons were blessed, their hands were guided, and their souls were reinforced by the Lord God. They had a strength that went beyond the merely material, because of their faith and their unwavering belief that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. It was a strength derived from a clear sense of purpose, from solidarity around common values, and from the conviction that in the eyes of the Lord God they were working for a worthy cause. We cannot comprehend Lepanto without considering this spiritual aspect, regardless of how we currently interpret those far-off events. Lepanto was more than just a naval battle for the men who fought and lost their lives that day, for the families who prayed for their protection, and for the cities that held religious processions to commemorate the victory. They believed that the Lord God had stepped in to save Christianity from an existential threat at that particular point in human history. This is the timeless lesson of Lepanto that will always be ingrained in human memory. That even the most formidable challenges can be conquered by combining courage, innovation, and faith.